Hello, fellow fiends. Welcome to another episode of Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces. I am your host, Cassiopeia. Don't forget, every Friday you can catch me on your favorite podcast platform with new episodes of the creepiest and spookiest content. And if you subscribe to the Patreon, which is patreon.com backscore creepy cases and spooky spaces, or the anchor.fm backscore creepy cases dash spooky spaces, you can get bonus episodes every other Tuesday, a merchandise discount code that is good on all merchandise in the Wick and Face shop at pizzaandpigtails.com. And you get a welcome box that has a little bit of creepy cases, spooky spaces swag in there, just as a thank you for all the support. If you would like to support without subscribing, because I know that sometimes budgets get a little tight, and you kind of want to be like, oh, well, I'd like to help you out, but I can't commit to a monthly commitment. So I have a Cash App and a Venmo, and also just buying merchandise on the Pizza and Pigtails website. Also, liking, sharing, commenting, following on the different social media platforms. That also helps because what that does is it gets the podcast seen, it gets my name out there a little bit more, it gets just more what do they call it, exposure. So just sharing also helps. Also, I have some ad space available in the upcoming episodes, so if you are a big business or a small business, and you'd like to get your content or your creations out there, definitely send me an email. Creepycases dot it's creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com. So now that that's all out of the way, let's get started on today's episode. Now, today's spooky space is known by many names. Most popular, besides its name, is The Rock, Island of Incarceration, Island of Freedom, Island of Alcatraz, Helcatraz, and there's even more. The list goes on and on. The island is steeped in mystery, culture, and of course, ghosts. The island is one of the most recognizable landmarks in the National Park Service. Starting out as a military base, it ended its run as the last resort prison to hold the worst of the worst and just those who had no hope of rehabilitation. It's been called the most fearsome prison of the day, and with the amount of brutality from guards, other inmates, and the inhumane conditions put on the prisoners, it is one of those that severely tested sanity. This is the spooky space of Alcatraz. Alcatraz Island sits a little over a mile from the shore of San Francisco, California. When explored in 1775 by Spanish naval officer and explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala during the Spanish rule of California, it was found to be 22 acres of rocky seabird habitat with very little vegetation. Originally, it was named La Isla de los Alcatraces, which translates to Island of the Gannets, but it's commonly believed to be pelicans. Even though the Spanish word for pelicans is pelicano, and there are no gannets on the island, it's debated that they were really calling it the Island of Strange Birds because they were just using a more archaic term rather than a more modern one. Now, the name Alcatraz was later applied by English naval officer and explorer Captain Frederick W. Beechey. It seems everybody was an explorer at this time. The first private owner of the island, well, the first known private owner anyway, was Julian Workman, or William Workman, co owner of Rancho La Puente, when it was given to him by the Mexican governor Pio Pico in June of 1946. And I just have to say that Pio Pico is an awesome name and it's fun to say. Pio Pico. It was so that a lighthouse, the first one on the California coast, could be built. The military governor of California, John Fremont, purchased the island for $5,000 from Francis Temple, and he was basically securing it for the United States. Now, Fremont actually ended up suing the United States government because he received absolutely zero compensation for getting the island. And the legal battles actually lasted well into the 1890s, but he came out unsuccessful in the end. Now, following the acquisition of California by the United States, due to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, which ended the Mexican American War, by 1850, the California gold rush had resulted in the enormous growth of San Francisco, and the need to protect the bay caused President Millard Fillmore to order Alcatraz Island to be set aside specifically as United States military reservation, and by 1853, they had begun fortifying the island and erecting facilities and the citadel. In 1858, the first permanent Army detachment of Fort Alcatraz was complete, and 200 soldiers arrived at the end of the year. Together with Fort Point and Lime Point, Alcatraz formed a sort of triangle of defense, or a holy trinity, as some may say, and this was to defend the entrance of the bay. Now, as the defensive necessity of Alcatraz diminished over time, its role as a prison would continue on for more than 100 years. The first military prisoners convicted of crimes were being housed by the late 1850s, and the isolation of the island that was kind of created by the cold, strong currents provided a perfect setting for this. In 1859, 11 enlisted men were incarcerated, and 2 months later, insane men delivered for confinement and safekeeping. Now, Fort Point and Presidio sent deserters, escapees, thieves, and drunkards to the island, and by 1861, it became a full fledged military prison. In 1863, the military began holding private citizens accused of treason, and by 1865, between military and prisoners, there were 433 men on the island. Now, during the modernization of the island of Alcatraz, the idea was to actually level the entire island and build shell proof underground magazines and tunnels. But this was never actually completed because they switched their focus from coastal defense to detention. Now, the inmates were originally kept in the basement of the guardhouse, but as the number of prisoners continued to rise, they built a temporary wooden prison north of the guardhouse. And in 1863 was when they built that. In 1867, a brick jailhouse was built when the howitzer rooms of the prison were just overrun with inmates. Now, in 1868, this was actually replaced with several adjoining structures. There was the lower prison that housed around 100 men, and the higher prison that housed everybody else. And it was officially deemed a long term detention facility. Now, among those incarcerated were Confederate soldiers caught on the West Coast. Army prisoners labored as part of their punishment. They were put to work. They excavated and constructed new fortifications, while others kind of did just, the daily work, cleaning and things like that. Now, some of the more untrustworthy prisoners were given inside jobs. They weren't really allowed to leave the cell house, and some were just confined to their cells just all day. They were identified by their obsolete uniforms with the letter P on the back of their shirts, jackets, and hats. Now, many American Indians were imprisoned at Alcatraz after troubles with the U.S. government during the westward expansion in the late 1800s. Some were Army Indian scouts that were convicted of mutiny. On June 5th, 1873, Paiute Tom was sent to Alcatraz, but he was actually shot by a guard only 2 days later. Broncho and Slowluck were arrested for participating in the murders of a peace commission during the Modoc Wars in northeastern California. The older members of this group were sent to death by hanging, but President Ulysses S. Grant spared the two young men and sent them to Alcatraz. Now, Broncho died of disease while Slowluck remained there for 5 years before joining the remaining members of his tribe, which were exiled in Indian Territory. Now, Kaitana, a Chiricahua Apache chief, who was a compatriot of Geronimo, was in prison for 2 years. And the army said that his stay at Alcatraz was a quote unquote complete reformation of his character. In January 1895, about 19 Hopi Native American men from Arizona Territory who passively resisted government attempts to assimilate them, refusing the orders to send their children away from their families to Indian boarding schools. And they were released after pledging to cease interference with the plans of the government for the civilization and education of its American Indian wards. Now, although they continued their resistance of government policies upon their return to Arizona. I mean, I don't really blame them, to be honest. In 1898, during the Spanish American War, thousands of troops traveling to and from the Philippines passed through San Francisco. Many soldiers returned with contagious tropical diseases, and all of the local hospitals, including Alcatraz, were filled with patients. Now, quite a few soldiers also returned as prisoners, and Alcatraz quickly became overwhelmed. Between 1899 to 1900, the prison population grew from 25 to 441. In 1902, an oil lantern fire almost destroyed the lower prison due to prisoner slash arsonist George Firebug Bender wanting to burn down the upper prison. That's basically how that fire started. In 1906, an earthquake and fire that caused a firestorm began to approach the city jail, and this caused 176 prisoners to be sent to Alcatraz for 9 days, as it had a fire resistant building. Now, fast forward to 1909, the Citadel, which was a 3-story barracks, was demolished down to its first floor, which is actually below ground level. Now, Major Reuben Turner, also a construction engineer, designed the large cell house that you see today. The cell house complex was built by prisoners over the Citadel basement and moat, consisting of 4 cell blocks, 600 cells, a kitchen, a dining hall, a hospital, a recreation yard, and administrative offices. It was the largest reinforced concrete building in 1912. And it actually had its own power plant with its own electricity and steam heat for the island. Now, the Army felt that the prison complex didn't really portray an image of military obedience and loyalty. So in 1915, the island was renamed the Pacific Branch U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, and the new emphasis was put on education and rehabilitation. Prisoners attended military training, remedial education, vocational training, and there was a lot of public disapproval. So they basically implemented new landscaping projects. Some of the prisoners were trained as gardeners and planted lawns of clover and bluegrass, as well as roses, sweet peas, and lilies on the eastern side of the island. And I'm not going to lie, that actually sounds like it was really, really pretty at one point. Most prisoners were locked in their cells only at night and spent their days going to work, class, and just participating in recreational activities. Work assignments varied according to how responsible prisoners were, and naturally, some prisoners took advantage of that low security. While on the mainland working assignments, some would sneak away to town. Several on the island used deception to board a boat headed to the mainland. Most tried swimming or clinging to wooden options. They never made it to shore, though. So some were rescued and returned to the island, and some actually drowned. The Army pulled out of Alcatraz, and the island was acquired by the United States Department of Justice on October 12th, 1933, and it was designated as a federal prison in 1934. Most of the prisoners were notorious bank robbers and murderers, and during its 29 years of use, its walls saw the likes of Al Capone, Robert Franklin Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, George Machine Gun Kelly, Bumpy Johnson, and Alvin Creepy Carpus, who served 26 years at Alcatraz, which was the longest of any prisoner there. The penitentiary is believed to be impossible to escape due to its isolated location. However, a total of 36 prisoners made 14 escape attempts, two men actually trying twice. 23 were caught alive, 6 were shot and killed, 2 drowned, and 5 are actually listed as missing and presumed drowned. The most violent incident at Alcatraz occurred on May 2nd, 1946, when a failed attempt by 6 prisoners led to the Battle of Alcatraz. Now, the escape attempt was actually planned by Bernard Coy, and 3 other convicts, Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer, and Clarence Carnes, were involved in the main plan, while Sam Shockley and Mirren Thompson joined them after the attempt had been set into motion. Now, Coy was a cell house orderly who noticed flaws in the prison security. The gun gallery at the west end was only protected by bars, and they weren't even really like super close together, but there was no mesh or any other barriers. And he learned the guards' routine and knew that there was a time when the gallery would actually be unobserved. In May 2nd, 1946, most convicts and officers were in their outside workshops, and Coy was in the main cell house, sweeping around Block C, when kitchen orderly Marvin Hubbard called an officer, William Miller, to let him in. As Miller was doing the routine check for any stolen items, Coy attacked him from behind, and the 2 inmates overpowered him. They released Joseph Kretzer and Clarence Carnes from their cells. Now, Coy, who had been starving himself to actually fit through the bars of the gun gallery, they actually had also widened the bars a little bit with the bar spreading device. He squeezed through the bars, overpowered Officer Bert Birch, and bound him. Now, he kept a Springfield rifle in the gallery, and he lowered an M1911 pistol, keys, clubs, and gas grenades down to the inmates. Coy then made his way to D Block, which was actually separate from the main cell house and was used for prisoners who were kept isolated. So, probably your more hardened criminals. This is where he used the rifle to force Cecil Corwin to open the door to the main cell house, and they released about a dozen or so convicts. Now, this is also when Sam Shockley and Murin Thompson entered the picture and joined the other four. Most of the other prisoners returned to their cells, but the gang put guards Miller and Corwin in C Block, and the six needed to get their hands on a key, which would be their way to the island's dock, where they had planned to commandeer the prisoners' launch, which would dock between 2:10 and 2:30. Now, they were going to use the officers as cover while they made their way to the dock and then made their way to freedom. Only they did get the keys, but they somehow jammed the lock while trying other keys on the keyring. So they were basically trapped in the jailhouse. Now, officers who began to come into the cell house on their daily routine were taken hostage, and when those officers had failed to check in, other officers would go and search of them. They were then held in two separate cells. Now, the prisoners knew that their plan had failed, and they decided to just shoot their way out. At 2:35, Coy fired at the officers in the opposing watchtowers, and he actually wounded one of them. Associate Warden Ed Miller went to the cell house to investigate. Coy shot at him and he retreated, but now the alarm had been sounded. Now, knowing that they had no way out, Shockley and Thompson urged Kretzer to kill the hostages, the guards, so they couldn't testify against them. Now, Kretzer opened fire, wounding five of the officers, three of them seriously, and Bill Miller actually later died from his wounds. Well, Carnes, Shockley, and Thompson gave up and went back to their cells, but Coy, Hubbard, and Kretzer decided they weren't going down without a fight. One of the hostages actually wrote down the names of the convicts, making sure to circle those in charge. Now, around 6 o'clock or so, a squad of armed officers entering the gun cage were shot at by the inmates. Officer Harold Stites was killed by friendly fire, and four others were wounded. The prison officials cut the electricity and delayed further attempts to regain control until it was dark. Now, Warden James Johnston asked for backup from the naval station Treasure Island, and two platoons of Marines were sent out. After dark, two groups of officers entered the prison to locate and rescue captive officers. At 8 o'clock, unarmed officers entered the cell house under the cover of armed officers. Now, it was actually a rule that you weren't really supposed to be armed at Alcatraz, but obviously, in this case, it was needed. Now, in the galleries above, when all of the officers were taken to safety, they drilled holes in the roof of the prison and grenades were actually dropped into the area. Now, the convicts would be on May 3rd around 12 o'clock. One of the convicts called Johnston to work out a deal. Johnston said the only thing that would be accepted was their surrender, which, of course, the reply was, "I'll never be taken alive." That night, the Marines fired a constant stream of bullets into the cell block until 9 o'clock. And at 9:40 on May 4th, they made their way into the corridor and found the bodies of Kretzer, Coy, and Hubbard. Thompson and Shockley were executed by gas chamber at San Quentin on December 3rd, 1948, for their role in the battle. Now, Carnes was actually spared from execution after hostages testified that he had refrained from carrying out any orders to kill them. He received an additional life sentence. He actually got parole in 1973, but breached the conditions and was sent right back to prison, where he died in 1988 from complications due to AIDS. The total count was 2 dead and 14 wounded. Now, the most famous escape attempt was the intricate escape on June 11, 1962, when Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin decided to swim for it. But all three went under, and they're basically still missing and believed to have drowned. Now, whether they made it alive, nobody knows. Although most escapees were caught or drowned, John Paul Scott actually made it to shore in 1962. But he was so weary and in a hypothermic shock when he was found that he basically was sent right back to prison. So, yay. In 1963, Alcatraz Penitentiary closed. Many reasons contributed to this. The expense to take care of prisoners was $10 a day compared to $3 at other prisons. Saltwater saturation was actually eroding the buildings, and transporting necessities to the island and waste away just became just too large of a task. Now, in March of 1964, a group of Native Americans claimed the island under the guise of the 1868 treaty, where they were basically told that they could take over any unoccupied government land. They were only there for a few hours before being taken in. In November of 1969, Indian activists demanded the deeds to the island, but in 1971, they were basically forced off by federal marshals. In 1972, Alcatraz became part of the newly created Golden Gate National Recreation Area. There's been no effort to restore the structures, and a few of the buildings actually burned down in 1970, but the lighthouse actually survived. It's open to the public as a tourist destination and actually draws in over 1.5 million visitors a year. And you can take a boat over to the island and visit the cell house. Now, with the amount of failed attempts to escape that and basically ended in drownings and shootouts, suicides, murders, there was a lot of death at Alcatraz, and actually Ed Woodkey was the first prisoner to commit suicide. Rufe Percival actually chopped off his fingers after grabbing an axe from the fire truck, and he begged another inmate to do the same to his other hand, which is actually kind of weird, but okay. Robert Stroud, who also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, was the most dangerous prisoner. He was in the system by age 19, and he actually spent 17 years at Alcatraz. He killed a guard, he tangled with other inmates, and he spent 42 of his 54 years in prison in solitary confinement. Now, many of the people believe that his spirit is still watching over his feathered friends from beyond the grave. In 1933, there was a murder escape by Doc Barker. In 1940, Henry Young murdered Rufus McCain by stabbing him in the neck, and Rufus died only 5 hours later. And they say that Alcatraz was so eerie, ghostly, and chilling, it could break the spirits of even the most rebellious criminals. There's also a morgue that had repurposed tunnels, but no refrigeration. So it was cool enough to keep bodies in the tunnels at the end until the boat could come and take them to the mainland. Now, since the 1940s, apparitions have been seen at the warden's home, which is now just sits as a burnt out structure. During a Christmas party at the home, several guards tell the story of a ghostly man who all of a sudden appeared before them, wearing a gray suit, a brimmed hat, and had mutton chop sideburns. Now, they actually stared at the apparition for a few moments as the room suddenly went cold and the fire in the stove went out, and the spirit vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. Warden Johnston didn't believe in ghosts, but he actually encountered the sounds of a woman sobbing while leading guests on a tour of the prison. The entire group says that they heard cries coming from inside the walls of the dungeon, and as the sobbing stopped, an icy cold wind blew through the group. Now, in the showers, you can hear banjo music. Okay. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the name Al Capone, and we're all familiar with his string of crimes. But did you know that while he was in prison at Alcatraz, he was actually in a banjo band? And he used to practice in the showers. In cell number 181, where he was kept, they say that you can actually see his spirit peering out into the desolate recreational yard. Now, on foggy nights, an eerie whistling and a flashing green light will float around the island, coming from the lighthouse. But it just vanishes, as most phantoms do. And I saw something about a keeper who actually died in a tragic accident on the island, but I couldn't find anything about this keeper. I Googled and Googled and Googled and Googled every term, every which way, every phrase I could, but I gave up because I couldn't find anything except a couple of the lighthouse keepers died on the island. But they say that you can see him walking the spiral staircase, still tending to his duties. Cannons and gunshots can be heard, and a creepy scream will ring out, sounding as if it's falling. And then there's a thud, and then silence. Now, the smell of smoke from a deserted laundry room, like something's on fire. Then thick black smoke appears, but only moments later, the entire room is smoke free again. In that same laundry room, there's an unseen presence. And there was actually a TV special that went in with a few paranormal professionals, and one was a medium. And they actually went in with an ex convict who spent time at Alcatraz. And the medium said that they felt a very strong impression of violence in the laundry room. And they described a man that they were seeing as tall, with a bald head and small beady eyes. Now, ex-convict Leon Thompson said, quote, "I remember Butcher. He was a hitman with Murder Incorporated before they caught him. Abel Moldovitz was his name, but we called him Butcher. Another prisoner killed him here in the laundry room." End quote. And prison records, actually from the 1940s, confirmed that Moldovitz was killed by another inmate in the laundry room. Cell blocks A, B, and C have visitors constantly reporting hearing crying and moaning. And they say that Butcher is actually a big presence here as well, and he's actually a malevolent spirit. In cell block C, there's a utility passageway where Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, and Martin Hubbard were killed. And you can hear loud clinging noises, but they stop as soon as the door opens, only to start again once that door closes. And there's also men wearing fatigues that you can see, and disembodied voices as if there's a riot going on. Now, in the hospital ward, part personnel have often heard voices and the screams of inmates who were often secured to a table until they were calmed down. Voices are also heard in the master hall, crashing sounds, running footsteps, unearthly screams, cell doors slamming, mysteriously closed, rattling chains, and the feeling of being watched follows you throughout the prison. Now, numerous mediums and psychics have claimed that they feel emotionally charged impressions. And this often happens when there's a lot of anguish or angst, a lot of terror and fear. When things like that happen, when the energy gets left behind, there's always a lot of emotionally charged impressions. They get the feelings of abuse, fear, and pain most often. And this has been said by multiple people, not just psychics or mediums, but just visitors and just, people who have visited like the ghost hunters and things like that. Alcatraz was basically where they broke the spirits of any prisoner who entered. There's cold spots, and the entire area is actually 20 degrees colder than the rest of the prison. Now, renowned ghost hunter Richard Sinnett and a psychic once spent the night in Alcatraz. And as he locked himself in 12D, he said that he felt an evil spirit inside with him. And as soon as the steel door closed, Sinnett felt icy fingers wrap around his neck. And the psychic actually said that they were getting visions of bodies of twisted, dismembered men. Now, Richard Weiner and Nancy Osborne, authors of Haunted Houses, had a strange encounter in cell 14D, along with a park ranger. They felt strange and strong vibrations and tingling sensations in their hands and arms. Now, 14D is where visitors report coldness and developing the room, and they actually feel more than one presence. Now, once again, in the 1940s, and the 1940s seems to be kind of like the hot spot of when a lot of things happened. So I'm wondering if there's kind of a, um, if there's like a coincidence there. I don't really believe in coincidence, but you know what I mean. So they say that a man actually died in this cell, and the stories go that he was actually screaming in the night that a creature with glowing eyes was trying to kill him. Now, they say the guards were actually just tired of his screams and just ignored him, but others were kind of worried about what was happening. And the next day, they found him strangled on the floor with handprints on his neck. Now, I'm wondering if this could have been a ghostly presence, or could it have been one of the guards that got to him? I don't know why he would yell that somebody with glowing eyes was trying to kill him if it was just a guard, but I mean, who am I? Now, Michael Corey actually saw a man with a shaved head who told him of being beaten, and his legs were actually broken by guards while in solitary confinement. One visitor who was taking photos at the prison grabbed one of who we call the ghost woman of Alcatraz, and she was literally just standing there staring back into the camera lens. Now, there's also a lady in green who is seen in the washroom of the former warden apartment on Alcatraz Hill. They say that she seems to be in her 40s with brown hair and a green dress. And some people say that she was the wife of the prison warden who committed suicide on the island. Now, I didn't see anything that kind of connects these two women as maybe being the same person. However, you never know. I'm not sure how many women actually ended up out on good old Alcatraz Island. But I would think that if they kind of coincided these two to be the same person, that I would find something about it somewhere. But I didn't. Now, in 1984, Rex Norman was walking through the prison when a steel door was swinging violently on its own. And the sound stopped as he approached, but he said it started again the next night and the next. And it would start as he would get close, or it would stop as he would get close, but then it would start up again when he wasn't like in the area. Now, there's a ghostly presence of a man dressed in late 1800s prison attire walking the hallway next to what they call the strip cells. I'm sure you're wondering what the strip cells are or were. This was actually a treatment unit of 42 cells in total. 6 of these cells were the worst of the worst punishment. Before you went in the cell, you were to strip naked, 100% completely naked. This was also on the bottom tier of the prison, so it was the coldest area. And one guard would actually mess with the air conditioning. He would turn it down so it was even colder. You basically had a sink and a low watt bulb. You also had no mattress during the day, no yard time, no showers, and no reading material. And you were usually held in there for about 19 days at a time. Oh, yeah, and your only toilet was basically a hole in the ground. Most prisoners were actually found shivering and crouched in a corner when they were finally let out. The other 36 cells in this area were a little more lenient. You still didn't have contact with general population, but you also didn't go to work or the mess halls, so you weren't really forced to do any labor. You were allowed one visit to the recreation hall a week, and you were allowed 2 showers a week. Ugh. You were also allowed reading material if it was prison approved. One guard, like I said, would also turn the air conditioner down here to make it colder. And I feel like that guy was just kind of a prick. Like, what's the point of doing that? Most people actually won't go to these cells alone. Now, have you ever been to Alcatraz? If you have, drop me a note down below. I would love to hear your stories. Did you get any photographs, any video? Did you have any kind of run ins or any, just did you have any apparitions pop up for you? I would love to hear that. Don't forget, follow me on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces. Like, comment, share, get that conversation going in those comments. Please be respectful of everyone. I do think that we should all lead with love. But with that, I will see you next crime. Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces with Cassiopeia is a Pizza and Pigtails production. All episodes are researched, written, and edited by yours truly. You can find new episodes every Friday, with bonus episodes coming out every other Tuesday. You can find the podcast on your favorite listening platform, or now you can find it on YouTube as well. Don't forget to follow along on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces, for all future news, updates, and maybe some content that you won't find on the podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe so you can get access to bonus content, early access to content, and a couple of little thank you swag. If you'd like to contact me about appearing on a future episode, maybe you would like to suggest your own creepy case or spooky space, or maybe you'd also like to reach out about ad space, you can reach me directly at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out through those social media platforms as well. And as always, see you next crime.